Welcome to The Being Guide, the lifestyle podcast that celebrates diversity of thought on all things health, wellness, and being. I'm your host, Charlotte Horn. Join me as I indulge my curiosity through candid conversations about health and life, with people who represent a whole spectrum of ideologies on what it means to be well. I'll be finding out what being means to each of them as they generously share their stories and leave us with insights that can be applied in the context of our everyday lives. Together, we seek to make sense of the paradoxes, raise awareness of the resources, and normalize conversations about the things that we are all thinking and feeling. It's not a one-size-fits-all, so take what you need and enjoy the show. When the idea of this podcast came to fruition, there were a couple of people who came to mind immediately. My guest today is one of them. Dr. Moyez Jiwa and I met on a very ordinary day for a very routine appointment, but what I took from our first encounter has stayed with me ever since. Moyez's approach to healthcare was more than just about his capability as a practitioner, but the demeanour that went alongside it. He shook my hand, asked sincerely how I was, and listened. Who would have thought that something so simple could be so transformative? I reflected on why that encounter had left such a lasting impression and came to realize that Dr. Jiwa had met my basic needs as a human being, to feel safe, seen, and heard. Human connection in an often disconnected society can be a powerful catalyst for change and healing, and that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. His book, The Art of Doctoring, speaks exactly to the experience I had with Dr. Jiwa, and he has recently turned this book into a course in clinical confidence to prepare doctors for the real world. In addition to practicing medicine, writing books, and developing courses, Moyez Jiwa is also the editor-in-chief of the Health Design podcast, an associate dean and professor of health innovation at the Melbourne Clinical School, University of Notre Dame. Today, we'll be talking about the imperative for compassion in Western medicine, taking a look at the current healthcare landscape, and importantly, discussing what we can do to maximise our chances of good health in a post-COVID world. Dr. Moyez Jiwa, it's an honour to have you on the show. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. The honour is mine. I'm so thrilled to be speaking with you today on this fantastic podcast. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. And how have you been now that we're kind of transitioning out of lockdown, aren't we, here in Melbourne?
No, it's been fantastic. It's really nice to actually go out and sit down when you have a cup of coffee. Who knew?
I know.
This for granted.
Having a cup of coffee from an actual mug is quite a novelty now. I'm just used to having it in my little takeaway keep cup. But no, it's quite a novelty again. Now, I think in my introduction, I probably only just scratched the surface of your many accolades. So I might just get you to introduce yourself because, I'm fascinated to know more about your backstory and how you came to approach healthcare and, I guess, Western medicine in this incredibly mindful manner.
Yeah, thanks very much, Charlotte. So the backstory is that I was born in Nairobi in Kenya. So we would class ourselves as East African Asians. And the thing about being an East African Asian is that we, in the 1970s, felt that we had to move. We were really economic migrants, but there was also a lot of nationalism in the countries in which we lived. And so a lot of us moved across the world. And I happened to end up in the Republic of Ireland. And the three things that I got from the Republic of Ireland in that time was number one, she gave me one of her daughters, which was fantastic. She gave me a fantastic education, which is also brilliant. But she also gave me this funny accent, which confuses most people who meet me.
I was going to ask.
Yeah, so that's partly what your listeners will be hearing is this funny accent and a name that doesn't seem to fit. That's the backstory.
That's incredible. And then am I right in saying that you studied and practiced in the UK for a short while and then you came over to Australia about 15 years ago?
Yeah, that's about right. So I did my training in Dublin and then went across to a little place called Dumfries and Galloway in the southwest Scotland and did my GP training there. And then from there went to Sheffield and Nottingham and then lived in that East Midlands area for a number of years before we came to Perth, as it happens. Apparently, all the poems end up in Perth. So that's where we started life in Australia.
And then how long have you been in Melbourne for?
Been in Melbourne now 6 years.
Great. So of all of the places that you've lived, where has been your favourite? Bear in mind that you're speaking to a poem.
Yeah, it's hard to say exactly. Each period in your life, there's something special about it. And certainly, living in Ireland was fantastic because it was very welcoming as a country to migrants when we were there. And then, of course, Dumfries and Galloway, you really have to be there to sense the sense in which people make you feel that you are Scottish, no matter where you come from. And then living in England was fantastic because we had a very, very nice home in a little town called Retford in North Nottinghamshire and raised our children there. Of course, that's where you end up as home because your children's friends' parents become effectively your family. Mm-hmm. So that's how it all panned out. But of course, you have to say living in Australia is the place.
Yes.
And Melbourne in particular is fantastic, as you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Now, just to kind of take a step back and look at your general approach to healthcare in a bit more detail. So as I kind of mentioned in my introduction, so I've lived in England and I've lived in Australia and I've been to the doctor on many occasions. And that, my encounter with you was one that, I guess it shouldn't have caught me off guard so much because I guess it should just be the norm that we feel seen and heard by, somebody who you're going to at a time of need and a time of vulnerability. But I think it's fair to say that there is a level of disillusion at the moment around, I guess, more traditional medicine because of the experience that lots of people are having. And, I think it's fair to say that we've all had a less than satisfactory experience with a GP and with a doctor, and, completely acknowledging that, the pressures that they face and, the fact that they are human beings as well. But I just wonder how it's come to be that in my 30 years on this planet, my 15-minute consultation with you, I left feeling all of those things. And is that a deliberate approach that you kind of, you choose to integrate into your practice? And how exactly do you do that? And can you kind of talk us through, I guess, the experience that I had, and if there's a kind of a routine that you go through with each of your patients?
Well, first of all, I have to express surprise that it made such an impression, because I would like to think that that's the experience that most patients would experience, because that's how I was trained. Those are the people who trained me, practiced medicine in the way that you experienced it. So I'm not aware that this is particularly different. And there are many doctors now that I know who practice medicine in that way. So I would like to think that it is not accepted that bad practice is what you would come to expect from a doctor. How did that all start? Well, that's interesting, because I'm not sure that I can give you a particularly satisfactory answer, because that really requires an awful lot of introspection. I would like to think, now in my 50s, that it relates somehow to the backstory of my life, I would say. So I went into medicine a very boring way. In fact, I got the results at school and I ended up in medical school. If I was to apply now to become a medical student, I would have to work an awful lot harder than I had to work as a 16-year-old applying to Trinity College Dublin. You have to demonstrate compassion, you have to demonstrate vocation, all that kind of thing. In my day, you just got in because you got the marks. So I ended up in medical school in that way. But there was something inside me that always responded to compassion, because the backstory is of a migrant, somebody who, and I would think my parents would have experienced this more than I did, but certainly to an extent, I guess I did as well, that somebody judges you based on how you look and how you sound before they know anything else about you. And that occasionally can be quite hurtful in a variety of ways. So I'll give you a classic example. So in amongst all the things that you say about me, occasionally I'm asked to do plenary talks at conferences. And there was one in particular, not that long ago, when I was asked to go to Coogee Beach in Sydney and deliver a plenary talk. Now, I arrived at the conference early. It was breakfast time, and I looked through the list of speakers, and I noticed there was a name that I recognized, and I was looking for this chap in the breakfast bar. And as I'm scanning the room, and this was a breast care nurses conference, a lady comes up to me and she says, "Excuse me, sir, but there aren't enough spoons at the breakfast bar." And she had assumed, given my ethnicity and given that I was wearing a suit, that I was one of the wait staff.
Oh, wow.
No big deal. I popped into the kitchen and said, "There's not enough spoons at the breakfast bar." But I told the story during the plenary. I opened the plenary and I said, "This is an experience, a very humbling experience, that we're not as great as we think we are." But that's the kind of experience, I guess, where that I would have felt kind of is very telling. I become very aware of assumptions that we're making. And that's one of many stories I could tell. And so your experience of being welcomed was me hopefully not making assumptions about who you are. And whether or not those assumptions were correct doesn't matter, but it made you feel good and you responded to, what I had to offer in terms of treatment. And that's what I want. That's what I want after the consultation. I want the kind of thing that you have offered, in that you see me as much as I see you. And that made a huge difference.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you for sharing that story. I'm sorry that had happened. And that's, not the first time that something similar has happened. But it's interesting that you kind of, you mentioned, you're a migrant and, you've lived in Nairobi and you've lived in Scotland and you've lived in Ireland, and England and Australia. And I do think there's something to be said for having that kind of culturally diverse background and being exposed to, a whole different spectrum of people and cultures and personalities. And, I've only ever lived in two different places, but even that, is incredibly eye-opening. And I do think there is something to be said for it building your capacity for non-judgment and for interest and curiosity into people as opposed to judgment. And yeah, that's definitely, my experience of having met you in the capacity as a patient. And I think there were a number of kind of, the key mindfulness pillars that I noticed that you were kind of integrating into our consultation. And I think, number one was the presence and, actually being there and being, making the most of that 15-minute consult and not kind of, I guess, feeling rushed out the door, which I think is one thing that does cause some people to leave the doctors feeling slightly, unseen. And that's all a very deliberate kind of, I guess, approach from you. And I guess because I've met you in person, but how has this transitioned with COVID and with telehealth consults, and where that kind of the handshake and the walking alongside one another isn't necessarily, we just can't do it anymore.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And whereas I think telehealth has provided us with an avenue to care for people that was not really available to us or not accepted by us quite so readily pre-pandemic, I think that for me, doing consults online, and it's usually by telephone because I don't enjoy the video thing because the technology doesn't always work particularly well in a dimly lit doctor's clinic. It feels like I'm playing tennis with a pair of snow boots on. It just doesn't feel like you're able to
It's a great
do what
analogy.
you have to do. And you're right, some of these things that you've described are very deliberate because they are habits which are cultivated in order to spark off certain behaviors, trigger certain behaviors in myself. That is to say, right, at this point in time, we have finished with that visit. Now we perform a ritual. You wash your hands. You make sure that you've shut off the previous patient's record. You gather yourself. You take yourself to the door. You call the patient's name, and you don't simply turn your back and march back into the room. You wait until you make eye contact with that patient. And, in the days pre-COVID, we all shook hands. So you made eye contact and you shook that person's hand and you said to them, welcome. Now you need to mean that, because what you're saying is, I'm here to help you. You've put yourself you've given me your trust, and I acknowledge that and I welcome you. Then you don't walk into the room ahead of the patient. You walk alongside the patient and you allow the patient to enter the space first and choose the seat they're going to sit in. I occasionally have patients who want to sit in the big doctor chair, and I'm very happy for them to do that. And then you need to know where your knees are pointed when you're sitting in that room. Because if you turn and your knees point at the computer and your face is turned to the side, you are no longer present. Your body is now facing the computer, and that's the center of attention for you. So you must face the patient. And of course, the last thing is you do not interrupt the patient for at least a minute and a half, because it's pointless, because they haven't had a chance to really tell you why they're there. And it's those pregnant pauses in which the patient will tell you the very thing that's bothering them. Now, tonight or whenever, I challenge you to spend time with somebody you love and just say nothing for a minute and watch them blurt out things that they didn't mean to tell you. Because those pregnant pauses are extremely powerful. They make us fill the space with things that are bothering us. And that's why we go to the doctor. It's an intimate conversation. So you want people to tell you things that really are bothering them, not, how's the weather type conversation.
That's a great tip, Moyez. I'll be using that on some of my loved ones to get to their deep, dark secrets. Thank you for that. So why do you think it is that these seemingly very simple gestures and these just subtle cues and slight changes in body language have such a profound impact on patients?
There's a deep psychology behind it, and I'm not a psychologist, so I don't know, but I've read and found various references to these kind of tips, as it were. But the proof of it is in the performance of it. If when I perform that, it's become reinforced behavior. And the biggest trick of all is to realize that 15 minutes, it might as well be 2 hours. Because if you do this right, you in that 15 minutes, you will achieve everything that you would like to have achieved if you were given a lot longer. And that's, of course, the thing that's most difficult to prove, because people will say, well, what's the science behind this? And where's the evidence? The evidence is in the fact that you and I are now having a conversation.
Absolutely. No, I completely agree. Like I said, I've been going to the doctor for 30 years of my life, and I've never quite had an encounter like I did with you. Do you think it's something that can be taught? You come across as a pretty naturally compassionate, empathetic, connected person. But, is this something that can be taught to people that might not be so predisposed to, feelings of compassion and empathy?
I think if you enter medical school, you are compassionate anyway. There is something deep inside you that is compassionate. There are very few, certainly of the students that we select, there will be none hardly, who don't have those seeds of compassion in them. What all you're doing is reinforcing the behavior that will be then reinforced by the response. from the patient. So if you say to somebody, look, I'd like you to try it this way, it might feel a little bit awkward at first because, who shakes hands with strangers anymore? Those common courtesies that we took for granted, walking, allowing somebody to old-fashioned ways of allowing somebody to enter a room before you, offering them a seat before you sit down, moving away from your desk and actually looking at them and pointing your knees at them. These kind of things are almost stereotypical behaviors, things that people say are very quaint, but where's the evidence? Why don't you get on and write the notes? You see another patient in another 5 minutes. Yeah. Well, what notes are you writing if you don't know what you're supposed to be writing, right?
No, exactly.
So I think they can be taught, I'm sure.
Yeah. And is that kind of what formed the basis of your book, The Art of Doctoring?
So The Art of Doctoring builds on a whole bunch of research. So I've been a researcher since my days in Sheffield, almost 20 years ago. And the research that I was doing was constantly looking for ways to improve doctor performance, doctor outcomes. And I gradually just, got into this realization that, in fact, it isn't the new drugs, it isn't the new surgery or the new techniques, that the technical side of things. It is in the simple acts that we perform that we could potentially make a massive difference to patients, and by taking up agency. So I'll give you an example. I talked about the chair before. So one of the experiments that I performed, and I did this as part of my academic teaching, was one day, purely by accident, I actually had my patient, the cleaner, move the chairs around in my room. So the big leather chair, which in that particular practice was for the doctor, had been moved into the patient's area, which was right beside the desk. And their bucket seat was sitting at the computer. Somebody must have needed to use the bucket seat because they were more comfortable in that when they were using my room. And it was all set up like that. And I noticed that I kept it that way. And every time the consultation ended, the patient said, "Are you here every day? Can I have your card? What days exactly do you work?" So I got the impression that they were enjoying the consult. And so from that day, I've kept it that way in practices where there are these large leather chairs set out for the doctor. And we performed an experiment where we tested this in a simulation, and we published that in the Patient Experience Journal. And that's one of the stories that's in the book. It's the whole idea, the theater, what I call the theater model, where the props, as in the chair, is a very important prop in that theater of the consultation between the doctor and the patient, the two actors, the doctor and the patient.
Yeah. And then, so now the book has transitioned into the course in clinical confidence, which is now being run with Notre Dame University. Is that right? So it's available to Notre Dame medical students, and now that, you want to disseminate that kind of even further afield. Did you want to tell us a little bit about the course in clinical confidence? I'm fascinated to hear about it.
Okay. So to go back to the idea of the theater model. So in the theater model, you think of the whole consultation as a piece of theater with the two actors, the doctor and the patient, the props, the script, the action, and the stage, which is the room. And out of that came the notion that the actor that we least focus on in our medical training is the doctor. We always focus on the actor being the patient, and watch what the patient is doing. Where are their eyes? What are the emotions they're expressing? What are the words they're using? We never focus on the doctor. And I thought to myself, the problem is that as a doctor, we've got a very busy mind. And if our mind isn't in the room, then that's going to seep into the atmosphere and contaminate the experience for that patient. And as it happens, I met a film director called Kimberly Warner, who I met on one of my podcasts. And she and I set up this course where we designed tiny little vignettes, little stories that the doctor had to act out, or at least to be aware of. So there were things like, you've got a pimple on your nose that's leaking down your nose, and you're consulting a patient, draw with lipstick, draw pimple on your nose and consult with the patient. Or, your partner needs to speak with you urgently. They're going to phone you in the middle of the consult, etc. And then there were scenarios for the patient, which were, you don't trust this doctor. You've got these symptoms that you think are cancer, all kinds of other challenging things. But the doctor didn't know what the patient's scenario was. And when they acted it out and they videoed themselves using their smartphone, the doctor saw firsthand what it's like when they are not present, and how their behavior destroys the possibility of a good outcome for that patient.
Yes. No, I did watch one of the clips, and it was two of your third year medical students. And I was wondering whether or not the scenarios that they were playing out were based on scenarios that have actually happened in real life, because there was one scene in which the doctor was, on their phone and, just very, very distracted. And I think, it's those types of encounters. And you can see it from, I think what's fantastic about it to begin with is the fact that you're humanizing both roles in this scene. And, the doctor, as much as they are there to support and to heal, like, they're a human too, and they've got their own pressures and their own personal lives, and even possibly their own medical complaints that they're contending with at the same time as healing this person that's come to see them. And this person that's come to see them is, in a vulnerable headspace. They're maybe scared, probably quite anxious about whatever it is that they're going to the doctor about. And, so it just kind of creates an environment where the two people struggle to connect. And then it kind of is almost a vicious cycle of, well, we've got a doctor that's distracted and a patient that's not feeling seen and heard. And then it kind of just exacerbates that. So I think what you've done here with this course is just fantastic, so that it, brings a little bit more mindfulness and compassion to both sides of the coin.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, this is real life, isn't it? How many times have you as a patient, and certainly I as a doctor, experienced exactly that scenario where either you're distracted or you're anxious about something and that person's not responding, or you've got something going on, you're selling your house and you're about to get an offer on the house and the phone is sitting on the desk and you're busy kind of checking every 5 minutes to see, is it in yet? This is a huge deal for you in your life. But that destroys any possibility of an encounter where you and I would be really trying to get to grips with an issue that is bothering you.
Yeah, absolutely. And there was another study that you'd put into the course, which was the stethoscopes study. Can you tell us a little bit about that one?
Yeah, that was a bit of fun. So if you read the literature, it tells you that the stethoscope is an extraordinarily powerful tool because it's associated with medicine. It's the icon of medicine. So as a prop, a stethoscope is an extraordinarily powerful thing to display in a consulting room, because you don't see it in the post office or the library or the tax office or wherever it happens to be. You're in the doctor's when you see that particular icon. We wanted to test whether when you put a stethoscope around somebody's neck, regardless of what else you know about them, you trust them more. In fact, we proved that because we showed people photographs of a man with and without stethoscope and all the other paraphernalia that are associated with medicine. And people were 5 times more likely to trust this person, regardless of anything they knew about this, simply because he was wearing a stethoscope.
Yeah, wow. No, that's fascinating. And, it's a course that you have made available. It's a course that's free and that can be, implemented with any medical school. So I think it's an amazing initiative that, you're kind of driving forward here, because ultimately, humanity in healthcare is something that's needed now more than ever. And, we might have lost a little bit of that connection over the last 18 to 24 months because, we've been stuck inside and we haven't necessarily had that human connection. And I think what you're doing is pretty fantastic. And it's something that even if you're not a medical professional, even if you're not a doctor or working in the industry, these are principles to live life by. It's not just, for your doctor to be displaying these attributes. It's, to be present and to listen and to be kind to one another. It's the things that bond us as human beings. And I think that, it's great that you're kind of really championing this within the medical world. Yeah. So I thank you on behalf of patients everywhere.
It's fantastic. It's a great honor to be part of it. And because the thing is that it's an enormous privilege that patients come to us and tell us things that are bothering them. And we often have the wherewithal to do something about it. And the reward is enormous. If you want to leverage that even more, you need to really connect, because if you really connect, you get to the heart of what the issue is. And 9 times out of 10, it isn't pathology. It is just, I'm not being seen in this situation. And once they're seen, you're on your way to being healed. And that's the power of it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Now, I do just want to spend a little bit of time talking about the current healthcare landscape, I guess, with a particular focus on mental health. Obviously, as we've mentioned, we're just kind of coming out of the longest lockdown in the world. And so it's probably fair to say that, mental health has rightly so been put into the spotlight. And I'm just kind of interested to see if you've had any observations over the last 18 to 24 months and kind of, I guess, what you've seen and what you think is kind of worth mentioning.
No, I think you're right, Charlotte. It's been absolutely awful being locked away as we have been. And quite rightly, I have to say, I have to completely support the government and what it did in terms of trying to protect us from this virus. In the end, sadly, it didn't work in the second lockdown that we've had, where cases continued to rise, even although we were in quite a severe lockdown. But the impact, the price that the population has paid has also been huge. We've seen a lot of what we call dysphoria, people just generally anxious, generally concerned for their well-being, feeling very isolated, feeling very locked away. And in cultures where you see that is a very alien feature, in other words, in cultures where we're very gregarious, where it is normal to see the extended family quite often, it is normal to hug and kiss and do all those things that people like in terms of getting a sense of being connected. Where that has been missing, people have become entrenched and dysphoric, and in some industries, 40% of staff have quit. They've said, no, can't carry on working. I'm not quite sure what they're going to do to earn a living. And they've simply walked out of their jobs, which is the sign.
Great resignation. That's what they're calling it, isn't it?
Yeah. Exactly. Very sad.
And I mean, just because, we're now transitioning out of lockdown, I think we all need to be quite mindful of the fact that, the lasting impacts that this will have had on our mental health. It's not just, now that we can go further afield than 5 kilometers, then we're all better, And so I think it's something that we absolutely should be kind of placing an emphasis on going forward. So I guess from your perspective, what are some of the key things that we can do to kind of manage our mental health and, really set ourselves up for kind of good health in this post-COVID world?
I think all the things that we did even before are even more important now. So making sure that we eat a healthy diet, that we exercise as often as we can, because most of us don't do that very much anyway, but also to cultivate some of those things that we had the opportunity to do more of during lockdown, which is to be more mindful, to make sure that the art classes we were doing online continue, that the music that we discovered is still a part of our lives, and to realize that there is more to life than simply going to work, and to celebrate that, but also to think about maybe that consumption a huge amount of consumption that we did before the pandemic and that we had to slow down. Maybe we didn't need to consume quite so much, and that might take some of the pressure off.
Mm-hmm. I hope so. I really do, Moyez. I hope that we kind of learn our lessons from, living at that really frenetic pace that we were before, and, thinking that that was the only way. But we've actually, if the pandemic has shown us anything, it's that, we can pivot to working from home and, actually having that balance. And I hope that we do manage to find some balance. I think for everybody's kind of mental health sake, the flexibility of the home working and being able to kind of not rush to get up in the morning and take your time and just move at a slightly slower pace. I think it's just something that a reset that we've probably all needed.
That's right. And it's also better for the planet, because think about the amount of aircraft fuel that we haven't burned in the last couple of years, and that's been good for the planet. Maybe we need to also be thinking more in terms of a greener life. Mm-hmm. Maybe more of us should become vegetarians, or largely vegetarians. That would be a good thing.
Mm-hmm. What are the kind of health habits that you've got, that you live by, that you feel like are the kind of best practice ways to live?
Yeah, I wish I could say hand on heart that I continued doing that during the pandemic. Mm-hmm. But of course, during the pandemic, we were comforting ourselves a lot more, and we were consuming a lot more between meals. And that was the one habit that I want to try and deal with post the pandemic, or in this new world that we live in, is not eating between meals. I think that's a very important thing. And of course, the exercise habit. I'm a very keen swimmer, and because the pools were closed, that's not something that was available to me. I don't enjoy jogging and running on the roads and whatever else. I'm not a cyclist. So I'm looking forward to that. And I'm looking forward to going back to the yoga studio, I have to say.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, you and me both. In fact, I've got a class booked for this weekend, which I can't wait for. Cool. I'm just going to pick up on, you sort of mentioned diet a couple of times there, and the kind of importance of that for our overall well-being. And I know that you've got one of your projects that you're working on at the moment is called the Future Me program. Can you tell us a little bit about that, please?
Sure. This is a project where we recognize that what we eat between meals it's called a fourth meal. We consume so many calorie-dense snacks. So, the muffin and a cup of coffee in the morning, maybe a biscuit at the desk in the afternoon, and then maybe a glass of wine and some peanuts late in the evening when you're watching television. All those, when you count up all those calories or the kilojoules, you are effectively sabotaging any effort to manage your weight. And so effectively, over the last couple of decades, year on year, the average person puts on a kilo per year. That's weight that is never going to come back off because of what they're continuing to do. And so by the time we're in our 30s, 40s, 50s, the majority of us are either overweight or obese. So what the Future Me program does is it produces an avatar and shows you what you look like today. And then it invites you to create another avatar. So you look exactly like yourself, and a thinner version or a fatter version, whichever you prefer, and say, I'd like to look like that. And it calculates the cost of doing that in terms of diet and exercise. So it could say, for example, if you want to be that shape, you need to eat 2,000 calories per day and exercise 4 times a week. And you might say, okay, that's fine. And then when you actually go to see how many calories you literally consume per day, you realize that that's going to be a very, very long journey. You're consuming more like 2,700 calories by the time you count up all your snacks. Mm-hmm. And so it gives you the opportunity to do something about it in a way that targets the effort and says, I don't need to stop eating those meals I enjoy, but I do need to stop stocking the car up full of these healthy snacks, whatever they are, which are really not as healthy as I think they are.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose having that avatar of, the best version of you is a little bit like a carrot dangling on a stick. So it's always kind of nice to have something to work towards. Otherwise, I feel like sometimes dating can be, you don't see the results because you look at yourself every single day. So it's kind of nice to have that. Well, that's really interesting. Is there anything else that you've sort of been working on recently that you'd like to talk about?
There are other things. And the one thing that I would mention is that I've been working with an American entrepreneur on developing a course in health innovation. And this is to point out to clinicians and even to patients that you don't really need millions of dollars of grants in order to make a change. That technology, and the pandemic has shown us quite clearly the power of technology, can allow you to create things which would have required a lot of technical expertise many years ago. We can now produce websites, we can produce apps, we can produce all kinds of things which can be done at relatively low cost. But the key thing is that they will be produced by people who are in the moment, who experience the very thing that they want to change. And that's what's making the difference.
Wow. Well, it certainly sounds like you've got a lot of plates spinning, Dr. Jiwa. So I'm, again, very grateful that you've taken the time. And I'm also very mindful of time. So I might just get to the last little bit of the show where I'm just going to ask you, first of all, just to kind of distill the conversation that we've had into, one or two kind of key takeaways for listeners, the kind of, I guess, the best things that we can do to improve our overall health and well-being. And I know that you've mentioned, getting on top of our diet and exercising. And so is it kind of really, those things, those lifestyle choices that you think are the things that can make the biggest difference?
They are. But in addition to that, you need to discover yourself. And I think that's the key thing. You've talked a lot about why is it that you do this the way you do it? And the journey back to see what is it that brings me joy? What is it that makes me bring the best of myself into the world? Mm-hmm. What can I create that is actually going to be something I can do joyfully? Then that's where your sweet spot is when it comes to health and happiness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, living life with purpose. I completely agree. Okay, so we're just going to get into the last bit of the show, which is I'm going to fire 5 questions at you, and I'd like you to answer in a word or a sentence. Yeah, as pithy as you can, really. You ready? Okay, so first question. What's the best and worst advice that you've been given? And it's 2 questions. I'm aware of that.
Best advice, be yourself. Worst advice, join a club.
Desperate to ask more on that, but this is a quick fire round. What's the biggest lesson that you've learned?
Never lose your temper.
Who or what inspires you the most?
People.
What is your daily well-being routine? If there is one.
There is one. I ride my Vespa scooter through town to the station, and I absolutely love it.
Great. That's a great way to start the day. Gosh, talk about start the day with joy. And the final question is, what does being mean to you?
That's easy, being present.
Beautiful. Moyez, that just about brings us to the end of this conversation. Again, I extend my heartfelt thanks to you for taking the time. As we're all aware, you've got a serious amount of stuff going on. So I really appreciate you taking the time. And I think it's a conversation that many people will benefit from listening to, and, just spreading that message of mindfulness and compassion and bringing that into everything that we do. And I think you're just kind of an exemplary person who's kind of living that to the fullest. So again, I thank you very much, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you so much. It's been a joy speaking with you, Charlotte. I wish I could see what you see, but maybe that's a good thing.
Well, look, I can vouch for it. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Moyez, and I'll speak to you soon.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks.
If you enjoyed that episode and want to learn more about Dr. Moyez Jiwa and all of the good stuff he's working on, then head on over to theartofdoctoring.com, where you can find links to his current projects, the Journal of Health Design podcast, his recent talks, and much, much more. Now, thank you once again for joining me, if you've made it this far, and I look forward to seeing you all figuratively next time.